Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Realtors 26th Annual Housing Issues Briefing. I'm Georgia Stevens of Compass Real Estate and 2020 president for the 7,000 plus members of the Seattle King County Realtors. We come together today at a time of tremendous pain in our country. Pain expressed throughout our nation in response to the brutal death of George Floyd. A senseless loss of life, all too representative of a pattern of injustice in our country. And this time we must protest injustice, we must grieve, and we must heal. But we also must work together for profound change in America. Let us not close the book on this and return to business as usual. Instead, let us write the next chapter. Let us commit to a future in which we double down on freedom and equality for all. We chose not to cancel our event today because your work as elected officials or candidates for office is needed now more than ever. Let us take a moment of silence to honor the memory of George Floyd and to think about how we each can contribute to making our communities and neighborhoods better. Let us begin now. Thank you. Housing is one of our most pressing public policy issues, particularly with regards to equity and affordability. Today, our goal is to give you some strategies and tools for addressing housing. We hope that what you hear today will serve you on the campaign trail and in public office. Of critical importance, there's only 6 weeks of housing inventory in King County and the central Puget Sound region, far shy of the 16 to 24 weeks of inventory that is considered a balanced or normal market. We have not had a healthy real estate market since 2011. And since that time, we've been well below the 8 weeks of housing inventory here in King County. Our real estate market is out of balance. Inadequate supply relative to demand has forced home prices sky high. It hurts our families, our quality of life, the economic competitiveness of the region, and eventually the tax revenues our state and local governments need to provide basic services. Today, we have the opportunity to learn from our distinguished speakers about what's in store for our economic recovery and about housing policies that will help restore affordability and build strong communities. What an important, relevant topic this is. Thank you for joining us. And now I'd like to take a moment to introduce our keynote speaker. I'm very excited to have you here, Matthew Gardner. He is our chief economist for Windermere Real Estate and will be leading the discussion on our economy. I'll let you take it from here, Matthew. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgia. And thank you all of everyone watching from wherever you are. I'm going to take about 30 minutes of your time to give you my opinions on where I see the housing market going, but we'll start off with the economy. And this is an interesting place to be right now. And here's why. We are at a fundamental change in time. What is, in essence, is the economy in the Puget Sound region has been doing remarkably well for a remarkably long period of time. And the trouble is, with what we've been through with the novel coronavirus, and as you can see here on this first slide, and this is just year to date, we've been growing at about between 2.5% and 3% employment growth in King County for several years, really since we came out of the recession. This is the last 4 months where we've lost over 17.5% of our employment. A really quite extraordinary number. Not surprising, obviously, the governor in essence, shutting down the state, and it has had some very, very significant impacts. And when we look at the breakdown as to what jobs have been gained or lost, as you can clearly see, everyone is in the negative column. Very specifically, however, this has decimated the leisure and hospitality industry, meaning if you look at downtown Seattle right now, over 80% of our hotels are shuttered. They are closed completely. Others are open. We are working right now at around 20% occupancy. But the job losses are centered in that industry sector, obviously including restaurants and bars and the like, but it's not just there. Construction, although I do expect with the governor reopening construction in the state, that number is going to improve. But you can clearly see our local economy has, for the time being, been somewhat decimated. And because of that, the unemployment rate has skyrocketed. Right now we are above 15%. Likely we will rise further in the next month or so before settling. And I do believe we will see a fairly significant drop in our unemployment rate in the second half of the year. But it's funny when you look at some of these slides, as we do as economists, the trouble is, even when we improve for the next several years, all of our charts are going to look ridiculously ugly because of what's gone on in the last several weeks. Unemployment claims are massive. We've been averaging really a couple of thousand per week before COVID-19 kicked in. And it looks as if we are doing a lot better. Clearly, the most recent week ending 23rd of May was a lot better at just over 14,000. But I do offer a word of caution about those numbers and whether that is as significant as I would like to think. Given where we saw with basically people forging unemployment claims, no one is really quite sure at the moment where the real number is. Although we can certainly say, irrespective, it is and has been elevated. The jobs that are lost are fascinating, and this has hit the ownership housing market nothing like as hard as it hit the rental market. So if you look at initial unemployment claims, i.e. through the job losses, clearly we know accommodation, food services, absolutely, healthcare and social assistance been hit, retail and manufacturing. But if you dig down into those numbers a bit deeper, bars and restaurants have been eviscerated. Ambulatory healthcare services, those will return, but if you think of it in these terms, these are doctors' offices, they are dentists' offices, which again have been shuttered. We are not buying clothes anymore, pretty understandable given the fact that we are all still working out of our homes, or at least a majority of us are, and transportation equipment, cars, trucks, these kinds of things. So it's very easy to presume that when we shut the economy down, it was going to be limited to, in essence, retail, or in essence, to hotels. But it's not. It's a little bit broader than that. Many of you, or perhaps none of you, will remember this sign. And there's a reason why I put it. Obviously, Boeing's announcement of significant layoffs is going to have an impact. However, this is actually a sign that was put up by Hendricks and Partners, real estate brokers, back in 1973. Why they put it up? Well, it's the Boeing bust of 1972. And this is important. The reason being is that from 1917 until the early 1970s, in essence, we went where Boeing went. If they were successful, so were we. When they weren't, clearly as this demonstrated, we actually left. Now, 1973 was the last time more people moved out the Puget Sound than moved in, which is somewhat interesting. However, the advantage we have today is, and really from that point, from the 70s onwards, is industry diversification. There's a lot of companies out there that now call Seattle home, and they are remarkably important as an offset. And please don't get me wrong, when I say that Boeing is not important, it really is. I'm not saying that at all. However, it is now not the be-all and end-all that it used to be. So even though they are certainly suffering, although I believe that they will come back, I would argue, stronger at some point, we can still thrive as a community and still continue to expand. And the same thing applies when we talk about employment and overall employment growth. A lot of these companies out there, they have not made any layoffs. They have, however, a lot of people, including myself, working from our homes. And that's going to be an important topic which I will touch on a little later on. However, my opinion is that even though we are seeing several thousand layoffs at Boeing, it is still likely that the Puget Sound region, when we come out of COVID-19, when we start growing again, can continue, even though it is clear that aerospace will lag. So from the big picture perspective, what do I expect? It's going to be remarkably hard, and I would question anyone who's putting out any kind of numbers regarding a forecast for job growth in King County, or indeed the Puget Sound for this year. I do believe, however, looking at the number of workers that are now, have been not laid off, but furloughed, that many of them will return to work as we reopen our region. So I think the unemployment rate will drop significantly and employment will pick back up. Quite frankly, I will be very hopeful and very thankful if by the end of this year, total employment, non-agricultural employment, meets where we were last December. If we can do that, I will be a very happy person. However, the big question is going to be, quite frankly, one, when do we reopen? When do we move into phase two? But more than that, it's also going to be what companies are going to survive and are going to thrive. Some won't. We know in our retail environment, there's going to be a lot of pain there. A lot of our bars, a lot of our restaurants will not survive. So the question is going to be, where are those workers going to go? So the extent, I think, is going to be out there. However, it is also going to be limited. I do expect we will continue on a path forward, but likely now not until next year. Technology, and we need to be very thankful for this. As I mentioned earlier, we relied on Boeing. However, I certainly see technology really thriving as we move forward. And most of our companies here, including Microsoft, Amazon, Twitter, Facebook, and the like, are still working. However, their employees are working remotely. When we end up, and if some of these people actually go back to their offices, those companies are going to continue to expand. They call Seattle home, and that is a massive positive for our region. The recovery won't be pretty, we know that. However, when I look at the makeup of jobs in our employment sector, I look at the talent that we have here in King County, and certainly in Seattle, which, by the way, the city of Seattle is the most highly educated large city in America. We've got a massive talent pool. That is going to be a positive. So once we've moved through and have our businesses reopen, I think we're going to do remarkably well on the longer term. However, there are going to be some headwinds, which I will talk about momentarily. So my expectation is from the economy, we will recover. At some point, the big question obviously is what that will look like. And the most important thing to talk about obviously is housing. And I start with permits because, and I'm not just including King County, I'm including our region because I think it is a very telling story. Unfortunately, we don't have county data for any month, quite frankly, in 2020 yet. There's some significant lag going on at the Census Department. However, when you look at these numbers, one thing strikes me very clearly. All our counties in the greater Puget Sound region saw an increase in the number of single-family permits other than one. And which one was that? It was King County, which saw a significant decline in permit activity. But then let's go further back and clearly see where we were in terms of permit applications back before the housing bubble burst. We're not even close to that figure today, yet at the same time, we continue to see population growth. It drives one question: where are people living? And indeed, when we talk about King County, which clearly is the job center for our region, where are these people living? And why are we not seeing more permits? Well, quite frankly, it is a function of space, but also price. Year to date, this is the average finished lot price for a single family lot. I'm not talking about a home, I'm talking about a lot in King County. It's quite remarkable and remarkably expensive. And so because of this, a couple of things are occurring, one of which is land being as expensive as it is for the construction community to build. But if you're paying over $250,000 for a lot, well, that house has got to be traded probably somewhere between $1.1 and $1.3 million for the home itself. And therefore it does drive the question of how deep is that market. And because of land costs and the escalation of land and land values, that is holding, I think, a lot of potential back because, quite frankly, we've run out. And so I do not expect to see finished lot values contract, at least significantly, at any time soon. And because of that, I looked at the average list price, and what I did here is these numbers, I've adjusted them for seasonality. We peaked back in 2018 at almost $1.5 million as the average list price of a home. Now, I'm not talking about West Bellevue, I'm not talking about Medina. This is King County as a whole. April numbers, we're still above $1.1 million. This is making it remarkably hard for would-be home buyers. And therefore, what's happening is Because of that cost, they are by forced to look at the resale housing market, which means that resale housing costs are going up at above average rates, even though they are at a discount to new construction. And we look at sales prices, again, year over year, last 12 months, we're looking at just shy of $1 million is the average sale price for a new construction home in the whole of King County. Obviously, with the peak we saw in 2018, which was also representative of the height that we saw back in 2018 on my previous slide in terms of list prices. But I would expect us to certainly be close to that $1 million mark by the end of this year. Sales, however, this is year to date, first 4 months of the year. Really somewhat unimpressive. I would be surprised if we end up getting back to the same levels that we saw in 2019. If you look at 2018, you say, well, hang on, what was the drop? Well, go back to those previous slides on price. How deep was that market? Clearly not. And we saw a lot of market pushback because of expected values. Affordability is something which is near and dear to my heart. For any of you who've heard me speak before, if there is one thing that worries me in our area in aggregate, it is housing affordability. I chair the Washington Center for Real Estate Research at UW, and since the early 1990s, we've put out an affordability index. And this looks at the affordability for a household making median income to afford a median priced house. Clearly above 100, there it is classed as being affordable, below it's not. So we have had a few periods over the course of the last few decades where it is affordable. It is clearly not today. But think about it also in these terms. It is not affordable today with mortgage rates at around 3%. Right now today, it's about 3.1% for a 30-year fixed. If it's not affordable at those rates, and although mortgage rates are going to stay low, I would argue for the next couple of years, that does not bode well. And that's going to have some longer term systemic issues. And one of those issues is going to be, it's going to force people further and further away from where they work. We are going to have a drive to buy situation, which we've quite frankly had in place for several years. In essence, if you worked in King County or in Seattle, Bellevue, couldn't afford to live here, you jumped in your car and you headed north into Snohomish County. That changed about 18 months ago. And what people are doing now is they're jumping in their cars and they are driving south into Pierce County, because there's about a $110,000 delta in terms of home values between Snohomish and Pierce County. Now, if you're doing that and you're driving or taking any other form of transit to get to your place of work, even though that might look different as we go forward, but I'll talk about that in a minute, that's going to put additional stress, obviously, on our freeways. And quite frankly, I would not wish the commute up through Federal Way on my worst enemy if they are coming into Seattle. How can it be fixed? Well, when we look at where incomes are and where affordability is, a builder would have to deliver product at this price point to improve affordability, to put it above the 100 mark. Now, I just don't see, quite frankly, anyone being able, from the building community, construction community, to build a home for less than $600,000. That is the price it would have to be to meet income and affordability requirements. But it's not just all buyers. I fear even more so for our first-time buyers, our current renters, our millennials who are out there. And by the way, if you think that anyone that's out there that thinks that millennials are going to be perma-renters, they're not going to want to buy houses, that's absolutely incorrect. In fact, over 70% of millennials believe that buying a home will be the most astute financial investment they'll ever make. But their biggest concerns are, certainly in this region, affordability. Housing has never been affordable for a first-time buyer in King County since we started creating this index back in 1994. It is quite remarkable. Now, what would it take for a builder? Well, they'd have to build a home for about $360,000. Well, you can't buy a shoebox for $360,000 around here, I hate to say it. So what we are seeing are a couple of things because of that. One of which is certainly pushing people further and further out to buy, or they become forced renters. And we've seen rental rates rise dramatically over the last several years and are likely to stay that way once we move out of COVID-19. However, it is going to be very, very difficult for them to get onto the ownership ladder. And yet it is also remarkably important. It's important for the vitality of our area and certainly the vitality of our county. If we keep on pushing people further and further out, a couple of things are going to happen. One of which is they're going to choose to live somewhere else and not here in terms of living, not just living, but also working somewhere else. So we need to be very cautious, and certainly most of the jobs are in central Puget Sound, in King County. How long can that be sustained if we are pushing people further and further out and becoming, quite frankly, somewhat elitist? From a demand perspective, these are my forecasts for the next 5 years for King County. I expect we're going to add on about 176,000 new residents. That's going to equate to a little over 83,000 new households. Given our ownership rate here in King County, that's going to give a demand for new owner-occupied housing units of over 41,500 new units, about 8,300 per year on average for the next 5 years. Well, you saw where we were with permits. Now, it's certainly very easy to say, well, hang on, it's not going to be a problem. Everyone's going to live in condominiums. No, they're not. We obviously saw some changes in terms of litigation and the ability to litigate condo builders or developers with a view that if they remove those constraints, you're going to see a lot more development occurring. You haven't, and it's really very simple when you think about why. And that is the fact it is remarkably expensive. If you have a developer who is building a high-rise in Bellevue, Seattle, makes no difference, well, those units, he's going to have to sell them for somewhere around $1,200 per square foot on average in order to make some profit. And it's because of that you have not seen a significant increase in new construction activity. So if we're going to have 41,500 new home owners, where are they going to live? That is going to be a problem, and a significant problem going forward. Migration is an interesting thing because it plays into what I've just been talking about. Going back in time, essentially about 25,000 children are born every year, been fairly stable for the last decade, and just about 14,000 people die every year. So when you take births minus deaths, you've got a natural increase, about 12,000 people in King County year in, year out. So births minus deaths. But what happens when you look at net migration? Those are people moving here from somewhere else. Well, then you add on right now another 24,000 people. See a peak in 2016. Well, it was very impressive, and it had been since 2012 as we were coming out of the last housing recession, but it dropped off substantially. Why did it drop off? Very simple, housing affordability. Because what we saw was a significant contraction here, but we did not see it in Pierce County. In fact, we saw an increase in Pierce County. Not so great an increase, but not so great a drop up in Snohomish County. So again, this just talks to the fact that we are pushing people further and further out. It was also interesting to look at the makeup of residential units within the county, and about 40% are multifamily, but we've still got almost 55% single family detached homes in the county. Now, that might have made sense back in the 50s, 60s, one could even argue the 70s, but does it make sense today? I don't think it does. When we talk about land and land availability, well, certainly we've run out. We have significant topographic constraints, too much water, too many mountains, and quite frankly, an inadequate mass transit infrastructure. So it would be very easy if we were a market such as, a good example, Houston. Houston has a traffic jam, they build another ring road around it. We cannot do that here. We have got a finite amount of land, and there's no question about it. And is zoning appropriate today as it was several decades ago? I would argue not. And that is a problem, because what that does is it increases home values above the natural rate of growth you'd expect to see. And when you look at the multifamily world, it's interesting, is the share of permits over time. Clearly, before the Great Recession happened, share was increasing while we were building a lot of speculative condominiums. Well, then we went through the bursting of the housing bubble, pulled back dramatically. And then, of course, everyone was looking at the apartment world. And in essence, the view was that it doesn't matter, because quite frankly, everyone moving here, they're never going to want to buy a home. They're going to be perma renters. saw a significant increase in apartments, but at the same time, we saw a significant increase in apartment rents. But right now, 80% of permits last year were multifamily. Now, I'd love to be able to break that out into what was condo and what was apartment. Unfortunately, we're unable to do that. However, it was just logic would dictate a vast majority of these were apartments and not ownership housing. I found this amusing. Minneapolis. It just shows the dichotomy that we have. The NIMBY, not in my backyard, as opposed to the YIMBY, yes, in my backyard. We've heard over the last several years, several plans and proposals to look at zoning, certainly here in Seattle, with a view to making some changes to it, which I think would be very appropriate. I'll talk about that in a moment. However, we do see just some very natural pushback. I live on Queen Anne Hill, and there are some rezoning going on, some development on Roy Street and down on Mercer Street, and that's fine, but some of my neighbors are up in arms. Why? They might lose their Space Needle view over humanity. And so it's a very unfortunate situation. And so we are already and have been, and we will continue to see a lot of pushback by neighbors saying, you know, we don't want to increase density as much as we should be looking to embrace it. We think here in Seattle that Seattle is a remarkably dense city. We've got too many people already. Well, I thought it was interesting. An associate of mine published this image quite some time ago, and it basically looks at the city of Seattle and overlays a map of Paris, France. Now, yes, you can fit Paris into North Seattle and a bit of Kirkland, and that really is meaningless. Cities come in different sizes, and that is true. However, anyone that thinks that Seattle is this massively dense urban metropolis, well, they would be mistaken, and here's why. Population of Seattle, just over 700,000 people, okay? And that's the population of Paris. So anyone thinks that, oh, and by the way, in Paris, there are very few, I can't even think of any buildings above 5 stories in height. So anyone that says, you know, we shouldn't look at zoning, we shouldn't look to enhance or embrace density, there's too many people here already, I would argue it's not the fact. So how can you get 2.3 million people in a space the size of North Seattle? It's really rather easy. This is their metro system, again, overlaid on the map of Seattle. Remarkable, mass transit is there. Obviously, I'm from England, from London. We have the tube, very, very useful, able to move around very easily. And again, that allows you to embrace denser neighborhoods and still get into your business cores. So emerging trends, what do I expect to see as we move forward? Certainly additional transit-oriented development. We've been looking at it now for several years. I would, however, argue that we have not gone far enough in terms of appropriate zoning around our station areas. Certainly they have been upzoned. Have they been upzoned sufficiently or enough? In a lot of markets, I would say absolutely not. I think it is a massive opportunity still. Now, it will be over a prolonged period of time. We all understand that. However, we are going to have to look at these areas, potentially broaden them, potentially increase density even over and above that we've done already today. So when I think about our market here, there's a couple of things which I think are going to be important. One, obviously Senate Bill 6536, that was Senator Das, died in committee in, I believe, February. This is a fascinating bill. In essence, it was taken from the bill which passed in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which eviscerated single-family zoning within the entire city. It has the potential, and still does, to dramatically increase the number of housing units. You increase supply, even though you have got a significant amount of demand. That actually changes prices dramatically, which I think is important to do. At the same time they implemented this, obviously it was adopted also by the state of Oregon. And in Oregon, it doesn't actually kick in until 2021 in areas outside of their urban growth areas, and 2022 inside their metropolitan statistical areas. So they're doing it at a state level. It was brought up in February, it died. I would love to see potentially another version of it. I think it will be remarkably important, knowing the fact that we have not got enough, quite frankly, enough land out there. Post-COVID buyers. Now, this is going to be interesting to see how this plays on in time. We know working remotely is not going to be just a temporary thing. A lot of companies out there, and Twitter and Jack Dorsey is a good example, are now saying, we will be working from home permanently. There could be some benefits to this because in essence, when you look at home prices, what do they look like? Well, in essence, they look like a wedding cake. The closer you get to the job centers, the more expensive housing is. The further you move away, the cheaper it becomes. Now, if we are allowing, or will be continue to allow people to work a majority of their time from home, it's quite likely you're going to see increased demand further away from our major job centers. But that's still a great unknown. We looked at this remote working scenario back in the early 2000s as a panacea. Is going to be the way we were going to solve all of our problems, but it didn't work. And it didn't work, quite frankly, because people who own their companies, employers, didn't believe that their employees were working. And the employees actually missed the symbiosis of discussions around the water cooler. We'll see whether that takes place this time around or not. How can we help? We need to address first-time homebuyers and their needs. We know we have a significantly sized workforce, younger workforce, educated, talented workforce. They do want to buy, but they also do not want to go way out into the suburbs if they can help it. If builders cannot, because of their constraints obviously land, expensive, labor, expensive, materials, very expensive, and finally, regulatory costs, which are remarkably expensive. Hopefully, you'll be discussing that later on today. If they cannot build to the price points necessary, how can legislators assist? It is going to be important for that to happen. And here's why. At some point, we have been remarkably lucky. I mentioned at the opening part of my comments that we had Boeing. Boeing, founded in 1917, has done very well for our region until the 1970s. Then a little podunk company out in New Mexico was playing around with computers. They became Microsoft. So we've done very well. And we've got a lot of companies here that are laying an immense number of golden eggs. But at what point, I want you to put yourselves in the position of a CEO or CFO. And you're thinking about expanding or opening up a facility in Seattle. What are the two things you think about more than anything else? I'll tell you. Number one, it's going to be, is there a talented workforce that I can hire? Well, yeah, we are wickedly smart here. Check that box. The second most important thing, how much do I have to pay people? And the biggest component of salaries, cost of living. At what point are companies going to say, I can't afford to pay people what they need to live? At that point, they're going to start looking elsewhere. Where are they going to look? They're going to look at markets like Spokane, Washington, Boise, Idaho. I will even say Las Vegas, Nevada, Austin, Texas. So unless we can start addressing the issues over affordability in our area, we cannot purely expect to see the economic growth be sustained at the levels that we have seen over time. Housing, shelter is remarkably important. It is an organic good. We need to provide it, adequate shelter, and also affordable housing. I would argue that it's one of the biggest issues we are going to have as a region going forward. And if we don't solve it, then quite frankly, I just do not see the way that we can continue to grow our economy at the rate and at the speed that we have done over the course of the last 40 or 50 years. And with that, I appreciate you listening to my comments. I'm going to hand it back now, and I'm not sure if we do have time for questions, but if we do, I'll be delighted to answer them.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for your insightful presentation. I'm David Kroll. I serve as the Government Affairs Director for Seattle King County Realtors, and we did have a question, Matthew. This is relating to your slide on housing affordability. The question is that the average or median sales price?
On the affordability slides, that takes median price.
Thank you very much. It's now my privilege to introduce our moderator for our speakers panel, Randy Banneker. Randy is the president of Banneker Public Affairs and a founding partner of Clear Path Partners. Randy, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, David, and thanks everyone for being with us. Thank you, Matthew, for that presentation. I'd like to introduce our panel. With us today is Michelle Rosnick. She owns and operates John L. Scott Property Management. Michelle has been in real estate and property management for more than 33 years. She began her career in public housing and banking. She was among the pioneers bringing credit unions into mortgage lending. In the mid-1990s, she acquired a property management firm that also brokers residential and commercial properties throughout the region. Michelle and her 12 brokers manage more than 600 units of housing. 48th District Representative Amy Wallen. Amy's district includes Kirkland, the Points communities, and parts of Redmond and Bellevue. Amy was elected to the Kirkland City Council in 2009 and was selected to serve as mayor in 2014. She raised Kirkland's profile in local, regional, and statewide initiatives, such as transportation infrastructure, and strategic economic development, including the revitalization of the Totem Lake Business District. She served as president of the Sound Cities Association in 2018. She was awarded elected official of the year from the Alliance of Eastside Agencies in 2013, and the Advocacy All-Star Award from the Association of Washington Cities in 2015. Amy joined the House in 2019. Welcome. We are also joined by Joe Fitzgibbon. Joe is the 34th District Representative in the House. Joe's district includes West Seattle, Burien, White Center, and Vashon. He was elected in 2010. Joe chairs the House Environment and Energy Committee and has been active on a range of environmental policy as well as housing policy. He has passed laws to grow the urban housing supply, promote transit-oriented development, and remove unnecessary cost drivers in state and local land use laws. Panel members, thank you so much for being with us. There has been growing tension in our cities about their responsibility and accountability in accommodating growth, and particularly housing. At a time when middle-income buyers are shut out of most housing options in King County due to high demand and limited supply, we have seen cities fail to right-size their zoning to encourage a variety of residential densities and housing types that are affordable to all segments of the population, as directed under Goal 4 of the Growth Management Act. Seattle, the largest and densest city in the state, has suppressed heights and underzoned its Capitol Hill, Beacon Hill, and University District Sound Transit station areas, the very locations where high residential densities are supposed to go hand in hand with high capacity rail. In smaller cities, we've seen moratoria and even down zones. Over the past few sessions, the legislature has responded with a variety of bills that seek to increase housing options at a range of price points. Most cities fiercely oppose state mandates like housing targets and minimum densities, among others, citing the need for local control and cautioning that one size does not fit all. We've even heard from city leaders that state mandates are needed to provide local elected officials some political cover. So with that, where does that leave us on the topic? And Joe, I'd just like to throw that over to you, if you would, please.
Thanks, Randy. That's a pretty wide open question. So I'll just pick the parts of it that are that I'd like to talk about. So we passed bills. We passed a number of bills the last 2 years to address the housing shortage, and that we've had a lot more introduced than actually passed. But I will say that I think the last 2 years have been some of the most productive years in terms of addressing the housing shortage and growing the housing supply that I can remember. And probably that predate my time in the legislature. And I really want to salute Amy for diving into a really thorny issue that really does matter for growing the housing supply, which is the multifamily tax exemption. You'll hear she's much more informed and well-spoken about that issue than I am, but that's a tough and sticky issue that she's tackled head first. Two bills that I sponsored passed, one in 2019, one in 2020. House Bill 1923 passed in 2019, and then this year we passed House Bill 2343, which really was building on the infrastructure of 1923. As I first introduced 1923, it was a mandate on local governments. It included a lot of housing policy, but really the central piece of it was to require cities over 10,000 in size to take certain actions to grow the supply of housing in their jurisdiction. And so rather than some of the other mandate policies that we've seen introduced that say, for example, no more single family zoning or something along those, or you must upzone in these particular areas, 1923 instead said, you have to do something from this list. Here's a list of a bunch of actions that will reduce costs for new housing, will allow more homes to get built. We're not going to tell you which ones you have to do, but you have to do some of them. And so I think that was well received by some local government partners, although the fact is it was still a mandate, and there's a very strong sentiment in the legislature because of our tradition of local control over land use policies, and the fact that a very large number of our colleagues got their start in local government to not have mandates on cities and counties over what they do that are really explicit and precise. So what the bill evolved into was a framework to make it easier for cities that choose to do the right thing and allow more homes in their boundaries to be rewarded from that. And the reward comes in two different ways. One, 1923 authorized jurisdictions that took actions from that list, we started calling it ordering off the menu, became eligible for a $100,000 planning grant from the state. $100,000 is not all that much to the city of Seattle, but really for most cities, that's a substantial contribution to their planning department's budget. And then we also provided them protection from appeals under the State Environmental Policy Act and the Growth Management Act, because that is one of the most common ways that people who are anti-growth, anti-housing, will try to slow down actions that a city does take to grow the housing supply. So even when a city wants to do the right thing, like Kirkland did under Amy's leadership, there are always these legal avenues for people who want to stop growth to try to block it. Sometimes with the cloaked in environmental values, although oftentimes these are things that have already been very thoroughly reviewed through other environmental review processes. So we provided the safe harbor from appeals under those two laws, and we provided planning grants to those cities. The bill did a bunch of other things, but I will say I've been really pleasantly surprised with how many cities have taken us up on that encouragement. I think just most recently, Lake Stevens adopted some changes to their zoning code, which will really significantly increase the supply of homes in that jurisdiction. But really all across the state, we've seen cities pick up the ball and run with it and say, thank you for the planning grant, thank you for the safe harbor from appeal. That makes it just a little bit easier for the cities that want to do the right thing to grow the housing supply. 2343 really just built on that framework by taking some of those items on the menu and making them more workable. As we have the experience of cities embarking upon the 1923 upzone process, identified ways in which that could go more smoothly. 2343 did a few other things. For example, it directs the Department of Ecology to remove parking from the State Environmental Policy Act. So when you fill out a SEPA checklist for a project, after this rulemaking is complete, they're not going to ask questions about parking anymore. That doesn't mean that parking won't be required. Cities and counties can still require parking through their development regulations. But one of my goals in looking at SEPA is where can we reduce duplication with other laws? If a builder of a multifamily apartment property is already checking the zoning code and the development regulations and determining how many parking spaces are required under that, do they really need to also duplicate that work when they're filling out the SEPA checklist, or perhaps an environmental impact statement if that ends up being required? So a big focus of my work has been trying to reduce duplication without actually weakening environmental protections. I think parking stuck out like a sore thumb for me because I really don't think that that parking is an asset for the environment. The more parking that is required by excessive regulation at the state or local level, that's doubling down our dependence on single occupancy vehicles, and I don't think that's a net environmental win. So that was a step it took. The bills both took some steps to restrict cities from requiring excessive amounts of parking separate from SEPA through their development regulations. They don't require exorbitant amounts of parking for a new multifamily building, especially if it's in proximity to transit. And we know that there are some cities that use exorbitant parking requirements to really just prevent multifamily development from happening in places that they don't want it. And so we've removed that, restricted that tool. That's one of the few aspects of the bill that actually is mandatory on local government. So those, I think, are big successes. I will admit, skeptical that our bill that we did in the 1923 passed in 2019 would change the world. It hasn't changed the world, but a lot more cities have taken us up on that invitation than I expected. One other bill that I'll highlight as a success story was Senate Bill 6617 related to accessory dwelling units. That bill started out very ambitious and very heavily mandatory on cities regarding restricting them from doing a whole lot of different kinds of policies related to accessory dwelling units. Again, mandates on cities, for all the reasons I described earlier, are challenging to get agreement on in the legislature. But we did end up passing that bill in a slimmed down version, restricting cities from requiring parking, again, for accessory dwelling units that are in proximity to frequent transit service. So I do think that's going to be a meaningful step. We know some cities have taken that action all on their own, but in other parts of the state where there is frequent transit service, and frequent under that bill qualifies as 4 bus trips per hour, then hopefully that will just reduce one more cost driver and allow people in single family zones to build accessory dwelling units on their property and contribute to alleviating the housing shortage.
Joe, thank you. And thank you for your work, certainly on 2343 and 1923. I know it was very important to realtors and is making a big impact on the ground. Before I let you go, I wonder if what's on your to-do list for coming sessions in this category of housing and land use?
Yeah, well, I think that we continue. So it's exciting right now. I think we have momentum in terms of rowing this direction. For a long time, the legislature just wasn't very active in this space, and if laws were passing relating to local zoning and housing, they were, if anything, going the other direction towards less housing supplies. So I think first things first, we'll continue to look at that framework that we set up in 1923 and then built upon with 2343 and figure, are there other ways we can improve upon that? For example, the appeal safe harbor under 1923, that only went through 2021. With 2343, we extended it 2 years to 2023. Should that be permanent? That's maybe a question that we'll ask. We'll always be looking at the menu of options to grow the housing supply that's in statute and that was expanded with this year's bill, and think, are there other tools? Are there things we haven't thought of yet that we would think a city should consider doing, that we want to encourage cities to consider, that we can add to that list and provide that encouragement and that appeal safe harbor? There was the bill that Matthew referenced that would have eliminated single family zoning in the state. I think that is a tall order. It's hard for me to see a bill that ambitious passing, but I do think that we can try to find, is there a way to slim that down? Is there a way to focus those mandates on areas where there's the most infrastructure in place to support additional housing supply? You know, one of the things that cities really bring up very frequently, and they're not wrong about, is that they only have so much control over what kind of development happens in their jurisdictions. They could upzone in some cities. Everett is an example. Tacoma is an example. Doesn't matter how much they upzone if the market supply isn't there, or the market demand isn't there for new units to get built. And so I think identifying what are the why not? What are the barriers? What are the barriers for Everett and Tacoma, and there are other cities in that category too, to help increase demand for the units in those jurisdictions. And then there's infrastructure funding. Cities are right that zoning is not the only impediment towards growth. Sometimes it is the lack of adequate sewer service. Sometimes it is the lack of adequate capacity on roadways. Sometimes it's a lack of adequate transit service. And so the legislature, I think, has not done a good enough job of supporting local governments with their infrastructure funding. The Public Works Assistance Account is kind of something that many legislatures have used in my time and before my time to bail out challenges in the state general fund. And I don't know that that's going to stop, but I do think that the fundamental problem of cities' fiscal authority needs to be reckoned with, and we never really reformed cities and counties' taxing authority to conform with the Growth Management Act. when the Growth Management Act passed, people made a lot of noise about, and oh, and in the future, we're going to update your fiscal authorities so that you can achieve all these things, that all these planning requirements that we've now assigned to you. We never really did that. And I think that that's something that we're going to need to address probably as a part of a broader tax reform conversation.
Thank you so much, Joe. Amy, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. You served as mayor of the city of Kirkland. Kirkland has done a better job than most cities in embracing urban cities. And yet, as we've discussed, you look around the region, and we, as a region, have never really embraced the idea of compact urban development. And just looking at the map, the overlay that Matthew Gardner did, which I love, Paris on top of North Seattle, where I think the Louvre is essentially Petco in the University District. But we've done a good job with growth management, preserving rural lands and resource lands. We've established an urban growth boundary, but it's been politically difficult to drive that growth, those urban densities, at a level that align with demand. And demand is triggered by job growth. And I'm interested in your thoughts on how those attitudes of the rank and file citizen how we can demonstrate to them that there is value in compact urban development.
Well, thanks for the question. I'm really proud of what we did in Kirkland, and part of what we had done there was a result of years of education and workshops. And Kirkland is kind of unique in its series of very strong neighborhoods and neighborhood organizations. And so that infrastructure existed where we could do trainings, and actually the planning staff were and are very progressive, and sort of educated the council members on the value of growth and creating compact urban development. What we did, I think part of the strategy though has been, and part of the tension that you see between cities and growth is that, people move into a neighborhood and they buy into that neighborhood. And so there's a strong opposition to change. And whenever we say we need to take more growth because we have great jobs, the people would, we would tend to hear, put it somewhere else, put it at Totem Lake. Well, in our community, we did that, right? So we did say, we're going to take our growth in Totem Lake, and we're going to take our growth in the city center where it makes sense. So it's a lot about education. And I also think that the reality of creating housing for people and being a welcoming community, we did a lot of work around, we are a welcoming community. And I love this slide that you showed about stop this development versus everyone's welcome here. What I'll never forget going to a fundraiser in Bridle Trails, and my own passion is around strip malls, old strip malls that have lots of surface parking area. And for some reason, we are just in love with those old strip malls. We don't want to see them change. And to me, those are a perfect place to take density and development, because they already have services and they already have transit. So if you let them put their parking underground or minimize their parking because they're already on transit and allow them to go high, you can create homes for a lot of people. So I was at this fundraiser and we were talking about doing that at Bridle Trails. And if you think about your neighborhood, there are a lot of those old strip malls that are not pedestrian friendly, are not using land efficiently, are in wonderful spots because they're attractive to businesses because there are people around there. Those are a great place for people to age out of their own single family home and make space for younger families. So this lady that I talked to in Bridle Trails said, I can't afford this big house of mine, but I also don't want you to upzone my Bridle Trails neighborhood center because I like it just the way it is. And I've really tried to educate people or talk about messaging is that it's not about change and new people are pushing us out, but this is actually making a service where you can age in your own community. You can grow older, your kids can live in your family home, and you can still stay in Bridle Trails, which you love. I have a 75-year-old friend, and she always says, I can't afford to age in Kirkland. I got to move to Omak, you know, and she's kidding, but not really. So to me, we have to talk about it not just in terms of new people and people coming in for great jobs. We have to talk about serving our own families and allowing them to live in their hometown. And we're not set up to do that right now. So I also think it's showing examples of beautiful developments. And we have done that in Kirkland. The Village at Totem Lake was a dead mall it had nothing to offer anyone. It was a tragedy and you know, we have converted that into something gorgeous and something that serves people and something that attracts people, something that's connected to the Cross Kirkland corridor, that has a lake that we're developing a park for. Instead of it being like a dead strip mall, they now have a vision of something connected to a transit and a walking path that goes from Kirkland to Bellevue and will someday go to Woodinville. And the Juanita Village, and, you know, if you can show examples of, wow, this is a gorgeous place to live, and those are coming online. And I also think the need is naturally coming online. I think people, if you speak to them in terms of where are your kids going to live, does your child have the opportunity to buy their first home? I think we need to talk about it in terms of that, not necessarily just in terms of job growth. And I always tell people, you know, the problems we have are problems of prosperity. I've spent a lot of time in Detroit, and those, you know, there's plenty of room for housing and people to live in Detroit, and those are problems we don't want. We have a prosperous and diverse economy that is developing jobs, but really we want to make space for our own people to live in their own communities. So, but that tension, I've always felt like as a city council member, having 300 people come into the city council chambers, or to do a SEPA appeal, as Joe referred to, where one person can hold up housing for a 400 unit development, that's wrong. You know, we need to say that that is not being welcoming. So I'm sort of rambling, but I think you get the gist. It's education, it's showing examples, and it's making it personal. So I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Thank you. Let me ask you to expand on one of the tools that Joe noted that you worked on, and that's the multifamily tax exemption. Could you just talk about how that tool works, and what the bill did, and if more needs to be done on MFTE?
Yeah, that Joe is absolutely right. That was a thorny issue, and I just sort of stumbled into it as a new legislator, not really. It was governor request legislation. There's an existing multifamily tax exemption tool that gives, it sort of encourages private development of multifamily development. So it was to encourage growth. It was a tool to help us comply with growth management, a very worthy goal, and to create density in centers. So the bill that the governor requested was to expand that program, because right now it's only available for cities over 15,000, to all cities and to counties. So in some of our unincorporated areas in our state, there's quite a lot of population density that could take multifamily housing. And so we want the private developers to build density for us. It was a difficult conversation in that it is a property tax exemption program. So what does the state get? Because other taxpayers are effectively subsidizing that. So a lot of interest comes into that. That's sort of the tension point, is do we have enough affordable housing? Are we encouraging enough different sized units? Are we making sure that the labor community is getting prevailing wage to do this type of construction? Do we have enough accountability to the taxpayers? So there was a lot of interest, and a lot of cities wanted this bill, and we did not get it across the finish line, but we did get a long way down the road, and I feel that is very close. The thing that was at stake that was sort of painful and emotional, I think, was that 7,000 units that are currently designated as affordable because they're using this program, we're going to sort of fall off the cliff and no longer be affordable, and then the owner would just make them market rate. So we were going to lose a lot of affordable housing. So the bill that passed extended some of the existing units, mostly in Seattle, or I think all in Seattle, from that cliff, and created a working group with all of these stakeholders to come together. But I'll tell you what, it's a difficult conversation because some in the legislature don't think that we should give a property tax exemption for multifamily dense projects because there's already enough demand. But you know, many of our cities want this because then they can attract, you know, Joe was talking about some of the demand is not there, but you can make it really affordable if you can use this property tax exemption, and that maybe gets to some density in the places where we want it. And there was transit requirements. You have to have frequent transit. I think it was within 15 minutes or 20 minutes regular transit service. So I'm a huge believer in many tools and for housing for all across the spectrum. We can't the multifamily tax exemption does not fix all of our housing troubles, and it does not fix our affordable housing struggles, but it is a tool, and I think that it should be available, and I think it should be available to communities across the state. And it does allow enough, I think it allows enough flexibility within cities for them to say, okay, we want this size unit, and we want, you know, we need this much affordability, and here's the level of affordability. We don't have to decide everything at the state level. And I honestly think that's the key in the state-city balance is the state giving its goals and then allowing the cities a little space to do the work within, which is why Joe's ordering off the menu was palatable to cities. You know, that was a great compromise. So ongoing conversation.
Thank you for your work on that. I know that subsequent to those bills being passed, we've seen particularly small cities that have very limited capacity to support middle income or lower income housing really embrace MFTE as a way to bring private sector dollars in to solve a problem that is very prevalent in their community. And it's really been a strong and helpful tool for them. So thank you. Michelle, I want to switch, pivot to you. Before I do so, I want to remind the audience or let the audience know we're hoping to be able to take some of your questions for the panel. You can do that on the Q&A tab that should appear at the bottom of your screen. It's next to the chat feature. So hopefully that will work for you if you have any questions for any of the panelists. Michelle, we wanted to include you today to give us a perspective as a professional in multifamily housing. And we've seen a number of tenant protections emerge in response to the COVID-19 emergency. We've seen it from the governor. We've seen a more challenging set of protections coming from the city council. We've seen some activists call for rent strikes. And wanted to get, from your perspective, understanding how these types of measures impact housing providers.
Well, the vast majority of the people that we work with are not large institutional landlords. They're mom and pop landlords, and they don't have the resources to deal with any of those conditions that you talk about. They oftentimes, their rental units are their retirement, and they live on that money. They're not, they don't have the resources to stand a rent strike or to withstand months and months of no rent. And in some cases, because of COVID, they've now gone 3 months, possibly 4 months without any rent, with no ability to do anything about that. And in Seattle, they could go a whole year without rent because of some of the, I'm not supposed to editorialize, but I'll say some of the wacko things that the city council has done. And they're going to lose their properties. They're going to have to sell. And we've seen a lot of that happen. Pardon me. We've seen a lot of proper owners that are selling their properties. They just don't want to do this anymore. They don't want to be rental property owners. It's not a thing for them. Some of our owners are rental owners because they have been forced into it. They've been transferred to another area, and so they want to come back here, so they've rented their property out. But now it's not worth it to them. They just want to sell and get out of it. And the retirees who are doing it can't afford to do it anymore. It's too costly for them, and they want to get out of it. So in one regard, it's good for us as professional property managers because we kind of offer a shield to them. Let us do your property management and protect you from some of these laws. And we try to do that for them, but it becomes increasingly difficult. And they're on a shoestring anyway, even with rents going up. So are mortgage payments going up and costs going up, utilities and taxes really going up, and they just can't afford it. So if they only own one or two properties, they're just getting out of the business. It's not helping. And the multifamily owners that have small buildings, it's too hard for them. So what they're really scared about is rent control, because they know that that's going to really cut into their profit, and we use that term loosely, because then they can't afford to do maintenance and they can't afford to do upgrades, and then we'll have situations like they have in New York and San Francisco where the buildings fall down around your ears. So that is a very scary consideration. We do sales in our real estate office as well, and we have people asking us now if they would like to, or if they buy properties, is it a good investment to buy rental properties? And for the first time in 30 years, it's not a recommendation that I'm making to people. It's kind of a scary proposition at this point in time. So if you've got the cash to do it and you want to take the risk, fine, let's do it. But it's not one of the best things I can think of to do with your money. Excuse me. And as I said, a lot of our owners are selling off their properties. So it's a very different rental market than it was 10 years ago, 5 years ago, or longer.
Thank you, Michelle. That's a sobering message. Could you just walk us through what happens when that small landlord sells? Who are they selling to, and what's the impact on the tenant?
Well, most of the time they're selling to people who are going to live in the home. They're not selling to other investors. Or they may be selling to a contractor or a developer who's going to tear that home down and build 6 or 8 homes on that property, because if it's a single family home in Seattle, it's usually a large lot, larger than a single family home needs to be on. And the tenant then it's necessary for the tenant to find someplace else to live. And they will go to, usually, if it's in Seattle specifically, they go to either a smaller property, many smaller square feet or fewer bedrooms, or they go out farther south, South King County, or North King County, mostly south because the rents are cheaper south, and or smaller, as I said, a smaller unit because they can't afford. If they're going from a 4-bedroom, they usually go to a 2-bedroom because they can't afford a 4-bedroom, certainly in Seattle. Often the single family owner has kept their rent low so they can keep their tenant, lower than market. And the new owner isn't going to do that. So if they're going to keep it as a rental. So the tenant is forced to find someplace that's cheaper or as cheap. And that means they have to move out farther.
Thank you. And I suspect that's true of a small unit building as well.
Oh,
not
yes.
a single family, but maybe 4 to 5, 6 units, maybe on up.
Right. If they have, if it's a small building, they'll have to go away. They'll have to go farther out to get a cheaper rent. They can't afford to live in the city or even in the outskirts of the city because the rents are too high. And a developer may buy the building to keep the building, but then they're going to upgrade the building. And then of course the rents will go way up because they'll put in new facilities and new upgrades, new appliances, pardon me, and the rents will go considerably higher.
But even if they don't make improvements, they're going to have a new mortgage that they have to
Pay.
serve. Yeah.
That's right. Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Joe, I want to go to you kind of on this theme about maybe how can we best strike a workable balance between landlords and tenants that doesn't put a landlord into the financial risk, the fragility that Michelle has discussed, and that also provides some stability for the tenant population. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's important that we keep those considerations in balance, and look at landlord-tenant policies that we enact with an understanding of how it impacts, how they impact tenants, and also how they impact both small and large landlords, because there are differences in that relationship. I'm a small landlord, and the not very nice condo unit I used to live in Burien, I didn't sell when I moved out, and I still retain it and rent it at a, it's one of those what they call naturally occurring affordable housing, which I hate that term, but and I know it's on my mind as it's in Burien. Burien has tenant protections not as strong as those that are in Seattle, and I'm fortunate I have a long-term very stable tenant, but I think it's not realistic to think that everybody is going to be able to become a homeowner. Realistically, if you look at what millennials as a generation have undergone now, millennials are in now our second recession of our, 12 to 15 years in the workforce, which is a lot for any generation. There was an article over the weekend about how millennials are the unluckiest generation in US history in terms of how much their earning power has changed since they entered the workforce. So we're going to still need affordable rental units. It's not going to be possible for everybody to buy a home. And, I think that some of the laws that we've passed at the state level over the last few years do strike an appropriate balance. I recognize the tension with Seattle having gone quite a lot further in terms of first in time and some of the other policies they have there. But the moves that we've made at the state level, I think, are responsive to the needs of small landlords, while also understanding that for example, a 14-day pay to vacate notice is going to result in fewer people being evicted and ending up on the streets than 3 days, which is what the old standard was. I think it's important that we recognize that the by far most common time that somebody moves into homelessness is in an eviction. And if we can do everything we can to sort of smooth out those rough spots a little bit so that people are at a little bit less risk, have a little bit more time to get their finances together and their life together before falling into a crisis that it's very hard to escape from once you enter, then that will benefit us all, really, and benefit the fabrics of our communities. But it's not, these aren't no-brainer decisions. You can't, and I think the legislature recognizes that they're not one-sided and that there's impacts whenever you add a new tenant protection or hopefully in the small number of cases as possible. And so I just think it's important to tread lightly and to listen to the voices on all sides, and also to not assume that any one particular landlord group speaks for all landlords. That's why I think it's useful that there's multiple landlord groups in Olympia that help us hear a diversity of voices on how these policies will play out.
Thank you, Joe. I want to note the realtors are opposed to rent control for the reasons that Michelle describes, but I totally understand and hear what you're saying about thoughtful, balanced legislation.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I didn't really address rent control in my answer. I was sort of more talking about the pay to vacate and things like that, pay or vacate. I think rent control does not have a successful track record in this country of ensuring stability and affordability. You look at San Francisco, look at New York, obviously those are not affordable jurisdictions. And when you have scarcity, which we do, we have a housing shortage, that scarcity has to get allocated somehow. And in a pure market system, okay, yeah, it's just going to go, the housing units are going to go to whoever can afford to pay the most. In a rent controlled environment, you haven't addressed the underlying problem, which is scarcity. So, okay, so maybe the units are not going to the highest bidder anymore, but they're still not going to everyone who needs them. And so I'm really, cautious about if we were to ever embark on rent control, which I don't think, the New York, San Francisco style rent control, I think is totally discredited. Oregon has a different model. Oregon has a more flexible model where they did pass the, end single family zoning on one hand to address the shortage, and on the other hand, pass a rent stabilization bill, which said that rents can't go up more than 7% plus inflation a year. Now that's a much more flexible rule than San Francisco saying you can't raise rents ever. And I think if we're ever going to look at policies that do restrict rent increases, which we've been very reluctant to do, those need to go hand in hand with measures that really significantly grow the housing supply. So we're not just trading one kind of scarcity for another.
Thank you. I'm going to do I'm going to throw over the panel a couple more questions before we go to our audience questions. Amy, I'd like to ask you as a small business owner and as a legislator about your priorities for economic recovery during the coming session, recognizing that the state has a steep fiscal hill to climb, and our whole society does as well. I've heard you on a separate Zoom call urge that we really need to avoid a false choice between business and people, and I just wondered if you talk about that a little bit, please.
Thank you. Well, when I first joined the city council 10 years ago, they asked me, are you a neighborhood activist or are you a business person? And I said, I'm both of those things. But I at the time was very naive and did not really appreciate that there is this sort of, has been historically in our area, some dislike of the business community, and also a lack of recognition of the broad types of businesses that there are out there. And I do think that this COVID experience has shown people that the business community is not some monolith represented by the Association of Washington Businesses. It's realtors and car dealers and little restaurants and places that you love, and family businesses that you love, and some of those businesses are being lost and won't come back. Small businesses are not unlike a lot of families that live paycheck to paycheck. You can't go 3 months and not have any income. So I just would like us to sort of see that our businesses are collections of human beings that make mistakes and are doing their best to get by. In my business, we have 100 families who work here, and nobody needs a college degree. And so this is a legitimate place where you can have a successful career and it's sad to me to think that within 4 or 5 months we will be out of business, and those 100 families won't have their jobs, and it's not like we're going to just pop back up. It's going to be closed and done. So I would like us to not demonize the business community as much as we sometimes tend to do. There's a big movement, to tax business, and the idea that business is not pulling their weight. And I just find it's tricky for me, because in my business, we pay retail sales tax and utility taxes and property taxes and B&O taxes and all the taxes that residents pay, as well as, business specific taxes as well. But in general, what happened in the Depression is that there wasn't money in people's pockets, and some big fiscal decisions were made at the federal level that I think we are, doing a better job of avoiding this time with these stimulus packages. I'd like to make sure we continue a robust unemployment program so that people have money in their pockets to support their local businesses. I'd like us to see more recovery funds to smaller businesses. We, haven't done enough yet, and we need to stay afloat for a few more months. I always now address the issue that B&O tax, the Department of Revenue has said that they don't think that the forgivable portion of small business loans are going to be taxable under B&O tax, but they at the beginning said that it could be interpreted either way. So I really want our small business community to talk to their CPAs and be active in advocating with the legislature to be sure that those recovery funds should not be subject to B&O tax. That's not their intent, it can't be used for state taxes. But I also think that this is the moment where I see in the Q&A, there's some, comments about property taxes, and this is our moment to possibly pause in so many things that we do. There's no traffic on the roads. The air is cleaner. People are telecommuting. We don't need money in politics because we can do all of it over Zoom calls. I have a million ideas about how we can change how we operate. And one of the ways that I think we need to change is our tax system and how we need to balance. We need to lower our property taxes and lower our sales taxes. And we do need some other kind of either income or capital gains or some other kind of taxation. And the problem is we have a lack of trust in government, so they're not going to let us have the authority to do an income or capital gains tax because they don't trust that we'll lower the others. So that's a big job, but maybe this is the moment to take that on. Specifically to me as a small business person, and at this moment when people are loving on their small businesses, I feel like if we could change from a B&O tax model to a corporate income tax model that would address saving our small businesses and also getting at that desire to make sure the big guys pay their fair share, because a lot of them are not. I think that's pretty apparent. And I love I'm proud of Starbucks. I'm proud of Alaska Airlines. I'm proud of Amazon. As you know, Randy, I'm proud of our big Washington businesses and how they've taken over the world. I think I don't hate on any of those. I love them. But I want to make sure that all of our taxpayers pay their fair share. And we need to restructure our tax code. And this is maybe our moment to do that.
Thank you, Amy. David, I'm going to go to you and ask if we have any quick audience questions.
Thank you, Randy. There was a question about, will we be sent the replay and the slides from today's webinar? And the answer is yes, we are recording. We will have a link on our website and we will be happy to send that out. I've had a few questions come in through my phone. And I guess I'll ask this to Amy. There were two questions relating to affordable condominium development. And let me size the two questions into one. Condominiums can be a great option and perhaps the only option for first-time home buyers and empty nesters. What more needs to be done legislatively to encourage more condo development, especially for those not seeking $1 million plus housing unit, but those in the missing middle?
Well, I think that we need more supply, as Joe has talked about, in general. So we need to, we've done some work on condo liability. That was apparently an issue, but now we need to work on conversion of apartments into condos to give people the opportunity of ownership. But we still have this fundamental problem of lack of supply. And that goes back to all of these policies that we're trying to do to work with local governments to allow density where it makes sense. So, again, I'll plug my strip malls. All of those become 8 stories and right out to the sidewalk and walkable, beautiful urban villages with transit. And maybe they start out as apartments to repay the builders' upfront costs, but how do we create incentives for them to then condominiumize, and that there's been a problem with that in our state. And I know we've addressed some of it, but I think there's more work to be done. And I think there is a role for the state to encourage, create some kind of incentive for turning apartments into condos. And I'm sure Joe has something to say about this too. He's, as you can tell, really knowledgeable about these issues.
I just echo what Amy said about the liability reforms in 2019. That was such a thorny issue that was around for so long, and a really, huge amount of credit goes to the legislators and stakeholders who worked through that. It ended up passing, I think, unanimously, and so I hope that we start to see more condos come online as a result of that. But like Amy said, this is really just fundamentally a supply question, and I think that hearing from those in the business of building homes about what are the real cost drivers, what are the things that are causing that we can address through policy is a big question we should be asking. And that's why you've heard me talk about parking a couple times. Is for a large multifamily building, the cost of each individual parking space could be $100,000, right? And so while I don't think we should be banning parking anywhere, I've heard that idea come up, but we're not going to do that. I do wonder, where are there places where we're requiring excessive amounts of parking in places where a parking space might not be necessary for every condo buyer. That's, to me, a really obvious cost driver, but I think there's others in that category too.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Amy. One last question. This is a spring from the discussion on rent control. And the question is, do you see rent control being adopted in Washington State in the next legislative session?
I think that's fairly unlikely. I will say that there's a lot of different policies that get called rent control, and that may not all be the same thing. I talked a little bit earlier about how you have the New York, San Francisco style rent control, where once you live in a unit, the rent can never increase. Now, there's all kinds of obvious economic reasons why that's a failed policy. I have a little bit more openness, or a lot more openness, to the kind of policy that Oregon enacted, where it's not a ban on increasing rents, but it's an effort to try to align rent increases with with what the overall economy is doing, right? So in Oregon, it's a 7% increase plus inflation is allowed per year. I don't know if those are the right numbers, but to me, that's qualitatively different than the traditional rent control. And then, like I said before, I absolutely would not support any kind of policy like that unless it came with a really strong policies that grow the overall supply of homes. Then, even within, less aggressive than that, there are other policies too that I do think make sense. The multifamily tax exemption that Amy has worked on so much controls the rents on a share of the units that are funded by that tax exemption. I think that's been a really successful policy. Now, does that qualify as rent control? I don't know. But there are elements of rent control that I think can make sense when paired with other good policies like MFTE. And so I wouldn't say that we're not going to do that. But I think, as far as seeing the kind of traditional name brand rent control, you'd be very unlikely to see that happen in Washington. I think one of the last thing I'll say on this is I'm more interested in, if we were to do something on rents, I would much rather that happen at the state level than for us to lift the preemption of local action on rent regulation and then see what happens at the local level. I think if we're going to have a policy on this, it should be a state policy, and not one of those where we open up the door for local governments to try lots of different kinds of things. I think that would create real disruption in the housing market.
Thank you.
I think if I may answer something about that, I think we're experiencing rent control right now. It's probably due to COVID, but we have no evictions, we have no rent increases, we have, and this is going on for months and months and months, and that is in and of itself rent control right now.
There've been a few more questions to come up. I want to be respectful to everyone's time. It is 1:30. If you'd like to have some real quick answers to a few questions that have come up, and we can all bid everybody a good day. One question was, should existing housing supply deficits be added to housing targets?
I think that's interesting and worth exploring. You know, I want to unpack a little bit what that means on the ground, but yeah, I think that sounds like a slightly more honest accounting of our actual housing supply than the current buildable lands process.
Thank you. Do you support the idea of moving Sound Transit construction forward after the pandemic risks subside a bit in order to both provide jobs and stimulus, but also to accelerate transit in order to support more density and TODs?
I definitely support moving. I mean, one of the things that prevents depression is infrastructure investment, and moving Sound Transit projects forward advances our goals in moving people in a clean way and supporting dense urban development, and yes, absolutely providing jobs as well. So that's my personal perspective.
Thank you. I'll ask one more question then. Observation, builders tell me they prefer to create townhome communities rather than convert apartments, less liability. They also don't like dealing with HOAs. Conversions are a logical answer to inventory, but local developers are not embracing that option. Do you agree with that observation?
I know there's a lot of controversy around HOAs, and much work has been done to try to create some HOA reform and possibly an ombudsman's office at the state level to try to address that. We need to overcome that problem, and there's work ongoing. I guess I'd like to talk to the builders a little bit in more detail to hear specific concerns to see if there's something that we can do to fix that.
Thank you very much. Our time has gone beyond a little bit, and Randy, if you'd just say a few closing comments, please.
Thanks, David. Let me just thank our keynote speaker, Matthew Gardner, Chief Economist with Windermere Real Estate, our panel, Michelle Rosnick, John L. Scott Property Management, Representative Joe Fitzgibbon of the 34th District, Representative Amy Wallen of the 48th District. Also, thank you to our audience. For public officials and candidates, we wish you the very best on the campaign trail. And again, thank you for your service or your commitment to our state. Lastly, we look forward to working together to heal our state and our nation. Clearly, there is much to do, but there is no better time to start than now. Thank you and have a good day.
Thanks.